welcome to the Bible study. My name is Kent Philpott, pastor of Miller Avenue Baptist Church in Mill Valley, California, San Francisco Bay Area. All right, we are still in the Gospel of Mark, just at the very end of chapter 14. So we're moving to the end, and this program, the title of this passage is Peter Denies Jesus. Peter denies Jesus. And I'm going to be looking at the passage, a few verses in Mark 14. And we're also going to go to John 18, 4 verses there. And I thought that combining them would have a fuller picture of this incredible event. So in the reflection that I put in a bulletin on a Sunday morning, when I came to this passage, I asked the question, are we more faithful than Peter? This is a complex story, and so we have to carefully go through it to make sure we've grasped the core of it. Peter was one of the inner three. You know, you had the 12, but there was an inner three. That was Peter and James and John. Peter, James, and John. James and John were brothers. So that's the inner three. By the way, Peter is not the head of the church, never was, nor ever until somebody along the line got that idea. Jesus is the head of the church. Peter would die a martyr's death in the area of the mid to late 60s. And the story goes that he refused to die like on a cross. He wanted to be crucified upside down. So we don't know. There are two letters that we find that Peter wrote, we find in our New Testament. They're just titled 1st and 2nd Peter. And by the way, Peter, actually the word means it's a little rock. You've heard of Little Rock, Arkansas? Well, Peter means little rock. He's not the rock. He's the little rock, but one of the greats. And here we find the famous Peter denying Jesus. So now we're moving to Mark chapter 14, verse 66. So it says, and as Peter was below in the courtyard, now I have to explain, Jesus has been arrested. He's going to be taken several places. I'm not going to take the time, Annas, Caiaphas, and so on. And here he's under guard. He's a prisoner. He's been taken into the area of the high priest. It was there in a part of Jerusalem. So they had gone inside. Peter had gone inside. And of course, because he was with John, Mark leaves that completely out. For whatever reason, who knows, leaves John out. And just as Peter, he's inside the gates of this big place where the high priest lived. So, and as Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came down. By the way, servant girls, it's not doulos, it's not a slave. It would be a worker, an employed individual. One of the servant girls, just one of the high priest. This was the big place here. And verse 16:7 says, and seeing Peter warming himself, that would have been at the fire. There was a fire going. Okay, there was a fire cold out. And Peter is warming himself. And she looked at him and said, you also were with the Nazarene, Jesus. Now, the way the word Nazarene is, it's a negative word. That guy, in other words. She must have seen him with Jesus. somehow or another. We don't know. Some speculation is that this young woman, became part of the early Christian community and was able to tell the story. We don't exactly know what happened, but in any case, here is the very words that she says. You also are with the Nazarene Jesus. Now, she knew that Jesus was under arrest, and maybe she was trying to say, well, wait a minute, this could be dangerous. Are you here to try to free your leader? There's a lot of speculation. When you look at the books that talk about this, and you can go a number of different ways. I'm not going to go anyway because it's not absolutely certain what's going on. But so here we have this event. Verse 68, but he denied it. But he denied it. Now, he could have said yes, because he was. Peter lies. He's telling a big fib here. He denied it, saying, I neither know nor understand what you mean. Now, she must have been wiser than just to accept this, because she knew better. She knew better. And we don't know, and we don't speculate how that all took place. But anyway, he denies it. Is he afraid for his life? They've got Jesus bound. Maybe they're looking for his disciples as well. Is it fear that is motivating Peter here? We just don't know. And then it says, and he went out into the gateway. He went out into the gateway. There was an inner part of this fairly mammoth structure. And he went out of it, not completely off the grounds. See, so he got away from everybody. He wanted to be alone. He was afraid. And it says, and the rooster crowed. That last little phrase is omitted by many of the good manuscripts, but it's found in our RSV, so we don't really know if that's what happened or not, but this is what we have. So he's out the front entranceway, verse 69. And the servant girl saw him. Okay, the servant girl saw him. Now, is this the same servant girl? We don't really know. We just don't really know. And the servant girl saw him. Oh, sorry, my bad. And says, and began again, the same one. My fault. That's a Philpott-ism. Anyway, and began to say to the bystanders, she's not talking to Peter, but to other people, but he hears it. This man is one of them. Now, is she maybe afraid? Maybe some of Jesus' followers are sneaking in. There could be danger here. We don't really know. Or if it's just that she had somehow been listening to Jesus and saw the people that were close to him. I think that's what it probably was. So, for the second time, says to the bystanders, this man is one of them. Now, the term them, they were all from Galilee, up north from Judea. You got Judea, Samaria, Galilee, Nazareth. That's where Jesus was not born, but that's where he lived. Okay, they were Galileans. You could tell by the way they talked, likely by the way they dressed. And so they stood out. You could tell where they were from. Verse 70. But again, now for the third time, again he denied it. And after a little while, the bystanders again said to Peter, the bystanders, those people who heard this interaction between the woman and Peter, the bystanders again said to Peter, "Certainly you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." One of the things in the commentaries I've read, that the Judeans down in the area of Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and so on, considered Galileans second-class citizens. And this may be one of the reasons why they're saying this again. I mean, it's just Peter by himself. He's not sitting with anybody else. So it's hard to know exactly what's going on here. But they could tell by the manner of dress, but they could also tell by the way he spoke, his language. Okay, verse 71. But he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, "I do not know this man of whom you speak." Wow. First of all, he invokes a curse on himself. In other words, I am damned. I'm damned if I'm telling a lie. If I'm not telling the truth, you can tell I'm really bad. I invoke a curse on me, myself. And to swear, now the word is a bit of a rough word, and it's that he is being demonstrative, you might say. He loved to have heard it, loved to see the look on Peter's face, but it's coming out of strong emotion. Strong emotion. Peter couldn't sink any lower than this. A dreadful thing. I would imagine it impacted him all of his life. I have a few things in my background that I wish I had never said and never done. And I can't get over those. I remember them. Sometimes it will come to me. Some of the stupid, crazy things that I did, even as a Christian. Just because a person becomes a Christian doesn't mean that they don't sin anymore. That's certainly not my case. And I will look back on those times, and I experienced them with regret, deep, deep regret. And I know in my long years of ministry and my counseling that is very common. We may even know that we have been forgiven, our sin washed away. Nevertheless, we remember those things, and it will haunt us. Now, I say that so that those of you who are watching or listening will apply this to yourself. Because I imagine most people do that. Most people do that. Now, it helps to be a Christian. Because as Christians, we know we come to the Lord and proclaim our sinfulness and ask for forgiveness, and we are forgiven. I don't want to go to all the verses, but our sin has been washed away like it never ever happened. God puts it away as far as the east is from the west, completely away. But we remember. We remember. And in my 55 years of pastoral ministry, I've encountered so many people who were horribly haunted by the things that they have done, both before they were Christians and after. Here's Peter. He's one of the 12. You can imagine that this event likely impacted him for all the rest of his life. We don't know for positive, but I would say as a normal human being as Peter was, he was probably greatly troubled when he would remember his sin. Verse 72. And immediately, or right then, as he was speaking these words, immediately the rooster crowed a second time. A second time. Now I have to read the rest of this to understand. And Peter remembered how Jesus had said to him, quote, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. You will deny me 3 times. Now, how did Jesus know that? How did Jesus know that? I have to ask myself that question because I figure and hope other people who are hearing will ask these questions. How did he know that? One of the gifts of knowledge, there's a number of them that we find in Paul's letters. There's a gift of wisdom, but there's a gift of knowledge. I have actually experienced this on 2 or 3 occasions. I don't have the time to tell you those stories, but I've had it happen to me. All of a sudden become in possession of knowledge of events that I would have no way of knowing what had happened. So it could have been one of the spiritual gifts or charismatic gifts of knowledge. So interesting that my little note to myself is 3 or 4 years earlier, Peter affirmed that he would be a faithful follower of Jesus. This he affirmed to Jesus himself. It happened exactly. And what did Peter do? He broke down and wept. He broke down and wept. Intense, uttermost penitence. Peter was struck by his sinfulness. Struck by it. Wow. Okay, now, we're going to go to John's Gospel, chapter 18, verses 15 to 18. These 4 verses are given in the English Standard Version of the Bible, the phrase, Peter denies Jesus. Peter denies Jesus. Now, we're going to cover the same territory that we did in Mark. But I wanted to bring this out instead of going to the next passage, the way that the Apostle John expresses this. Very interesting. You'll find stories in the Scripture where Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John will report the same event, but they're all different from each other. Not in material ways or contradicting or denying, none of that, but they'll bring in various references and things that not each of them says. So we find that very interesting. And so here we now in John 18, we find John's account of this. Mark's gospel would have been written 55 AD or Common Era. John, not written until the 90s, late 80s or early 90s, long time afterwards. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke would all 3 have been published already, written, when John writes his gospel. So now here we are, John 18:15. Simon Peter followed Jesus. Simon was his real name. Peter was his nickname. Again, it's Little Rock, like Little Rock, Arkansas. So Simon Peter followed Jesus. That's when Jesus is being led away from the Garden of Gethsemane into the city of Jerusalem. And it says, and so did another disciple. Now we know this is John, but he refuses to name himself here. That's interesting. And the question becomes, how is it that John actually had access, could go into the courtyard of the high priest? Come on, that's a big deal. How is it that John could do this? Well, here's the speculation. James and John Zebedee and his father, the boys and their father were fishermen. We know that they were fishermen. It is thought that they would bring fish caught down to the high priest's place. Would have been paid for. That's how they made their living. And we know they had a big boat. And so John would have been recognized because he'd been coming there maybe for some period of time. They knew who this guy was. He's the son of Zebedee. He's John. Okay? He's one of our guys that sells us fish. Speculation, I suppose. So, by the way, in John 18, verse 10, five verses before this, we find that John, the one I'm speculating came with Peter, John knows the name of the high priest's servant, whose name was Malchus. We find that in the early verses of John. So John knew this guy Malchus. He knows the name of the high priest's number one servant, Malchus. Okay. So he entered, that is, John entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. It was enclosed, but you didn't have a roof over it. It was enclosed, where the fire would be, and then the main house you could see into. Verse 16. But Peter stood outside at the door. He stood outside. Peter couldn't get in himself. So the other disciple, this is John, of course, what we're thinking is. It doesn't say it's John, but it's got to be John. So the other disciple, John, who was known to the high priest, known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door and brought Peter in. So that's how Peter gets in. John tells the story. He knew it did not appear in Matthew's gospel or Mark's gospel or Luke's gospel, but now all these people are gone. Peter would have died at least 30 years prior to this period of time. He would have been killed by the Romans. None of the other disciples would have been alive. Young John, was the only of the 12 apostles who died a natural death. All the rest were killed. So Peter's outside, but John, he goes and talks to the servant girl, the hired servant girl, who was standing guard at the door, and brings Peter in. She lets John bring Peter in. Like to have heard the exchange. There's a whole bunch of stuff we'd like to hear. And maybe one day we'll get to. I wouldn't be surprised if we don't get a chance to take a look at the genuine film of all of the life of Jesus. I know that's kind of a stupid thing to be talking about, but I can't help it. I would love to see that. I think we will. Verse 17. The servant girl at the door said to Peter, okay, John, go get Peter. They're there. The servant girl's there, but he's not going to get away with it. The servant girl at the door said to Peter, you also are not one of the man's disciples, are you? He said, I am not. So anyway, it's very interesting. He says, I am not. We have only one denial here in John's gospel. In Mark, we find three. John just gives us the highlight or the primary event that was taking place here. He says, I am not. So that's a very troubling thing for Peter. As I said earlier in the program, I would suppose if Peter was anything like myself or most Christians that I know, that denial would have troubled him all the rest of his life. And again, I want to emphasize, despite the fact that he had been forgiven, what happens when we become a follower of Jesus on a point of our conversion? All of our sin is gone. Remember the difference between Kairos time, which is God's time, which is God's all time is now. How that God is, God is about 1,000,000 trillion times bigger than we are. We can't compare ourselves to Chronos time, chronological time. We live in Chronos time. Here we encounter Kairos time again. At Kairos time. All of our sin that we have committed from the first time we know that we acted and voiced against who God is and God's truth, all that sin up to the very end of our lives has been all forgiven in Kairos time. My sin is gone, although I continue to sin. Yes, that is a conundrum. That is something we are never going to understand. It's what's called a paradox, two parallel truths. I am a sinner, I am forgiven. Verse 18. Now the servants and officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. I don't have the time to go through what happened to Peter, very similar to the events that took place in Mark's gospel. But here he is. A very curious thing. Peter is so attached to Jesus that he risked his life by following him into the courtyard of the high priest, and there's going to be soldiers around. He knows this. But yet he does that. But then he lies about it because he's scared to death that he's going to be treated as about as rough as you can. So I remember when I was first a Christian at Travis Air Force Base, I was a medic in the military, and I denied Jesus in front of others. I have this note to myself. I refused to sit with Don Etheridge and Vern Hogue because they were identified as Christians, and I didn't want to identify with them. And we just know how badly Peter must have felt. And I just wonder, have you ever experienced that yourself? If you ever had experienced the awful experience of you having been sinned, and to know that Jesus cleanses us from all sin. So long.